decklist video for the Skull Servant Outlet build, which will be my current final build for the Skull Servant or Deadbeat deck. Now it does use two cards that still are not out in TCG. They will be coming out in the next set. However, as you can see, I'm doing this deck list on the yugioh Pro deck. Now I have three reasons for this. The first reason is Master Duel actually has a deck limit of 25. So, given the fact that there are over 70 members of Holo Live alone, not including all of the members of Holo Stars, it isn't really feasible to build that many decks. I will try to build some of them in Master Duel just to show off some of the combos, but I'm going to be using Master Duel more as a resource for decks that I actually want to build for myself. The second reason is, again, resources. It takes a long time to gather the crafting materials for cards as well as the card generation resources. So, for time's sake, only building decks that I would actually consistently use would be more worthwhile. And the third reason is Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel runs on an OCG card list. And this actually has affected some of my decks that I was going to build for this, where I could not build the decks I wanted because a couple of the cards were TCG exclusives. So I've decided to move it to yugioh Pro deck, which has the TCG cards and the OCG cards, not just the OCG exclusives. But on to the deck list. So of course, if you've seen my stream, we already know most of the original Skull Servants. Skull Servant itself, simple vanilla monster, no effect, 300 attack, 200 defense. More or less just try to get all of these copies in the graveyard before you even see them in the hand. Of course, we have the boss of our deck, King of the Skull Servants. It has a question mark attack, which means at base value it'll be 0, and it will then be based on its effect, which King of the Skull Servant's effect is for every king or Skull Servant in the graveyard, it gains 1,000 attack. It also has a secondary effect. When it's destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, I can banish another Skull Servant to special summon it, which will reduce its attack by 1,000, but keep it on the field. Next up, of course, we have White Princess, and all of the white monsters have the effect that they become Skull Servants in the graveyard, so they also give attack to the King of the Skull Servants. However, this one has two other effects as well. If it's normal or special summoned, I send one White Prince to the deck, and I will show that card next. But it sends White Prince to the graveyard, and during either player's turn, I can send her to the graveyard, and all of my enemy's monsters lose attack and defense, or 300 times their level or rank. Now, ranks being the determining factor for Xyz monsters. So next up, we have White Prince. White Prince's effect is if it's sent to the graveyard, I can send a Skull Servant and one Lady in White. So if this card gets sent, send 2 more from my hand or deck to the graveyard. And it also allows me to banish 3 Skull Servants from the graveyard to summon a King of the Skull Servants from the deck. Now, of course, one of the cards is the Skull Servant itself. The other card is Lady in White. Highest defense stat in archetype. And while she's on field, other Skull Servants basically, but she can also affect other zombie monsters, cannot be destroyed by battle, and are unaffected by spell card or trap effects. So no cards can affect your monsters on board. White Bacon, probably one of the better searchers. Of course, it comes Skull Servant in the graveyard. Now, this one is a protection effect if it's a protection hand trap. So if an opponent would destroy one of your level 3 or lower zombie monsters, send that to the graveyard instead. And when sent to the graveyard, you add 2 monsters with different names from your deck, except for white baking, that are Skull Servants or Mention It. Then you discard 1 card. So a popular combo with this is, if they were going to destroy King of Skull Servants, send White Baking to the graveyard and add yourself a copy of White Lord and White Prince. Discard the White Prince discards Skull Servant and Lady in White, and then you can also discard the White Lord. If you have Skull Servant or King of the Skull Servants in a graveyard, you can send this card as a hand trap, so from hand or field to graveyard, and then you send cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard up to the number of Skull Servants in the graveyard. Then, while it's in the graveyard, you can banish it to special summon a King of the Skull Servant or Skull Servant in the graveyard. So it's kind of a revival effect, and also pitches a large amount of your deck if you already have a lot of Skull Servants. Next up we have White Mare. As per usual, becomes Skull Servant in graveyard. You can discard this card to target a banished Skull Servant or White Mare, return it to the graveyard. Now, one thing to take note of, these Skull Servants only become Skull Servants in the graveyard. So when they're banished, they're no longer Skull Servants. So it would have to be one of these 2. Or not even these 2. It would either have to be Skull Servant or White Mare itself to return to the graveyard. However, it can also target a banished Lady in White or King of the Skull Servants to special summon it rather than send it to the graveyard from the Vanish Zone. Next up, we have the 2 new cards that have not been released yet. We have Moisa White. Now, when this card is normal or special summoned, add 1 Skull Servant or a card that mentions it from deck to hand except Moisa White. And you can't special summon for the rest of the turn except zombies. So not really a drawback for your deck, and it searches any card that mentions Skull Servant. Now it is a hard once per turn, so you can only use the effect of Moisa White once per turn. Then, while it's on the field, it counts as a once per turn double summon, so you can normal summon a level 4 or lower zombie from your hand. And once again, it's a hard once per turn, so if you have 2 copies of Moisa White, you still only get the 1 double summon. Next up we have White Master. Now this is the other new card that's being released in Alliance Insight, which is the next main set that comes out for Yu-Gi-Oh! Now this one is honestly terrifying. This might actually make Skull Servant somewhat meta again. It gives King of the Skull Servant piercing damage, which means this deck's main weakness of having a defense position monster stopping all of the damage of the King of the Skull Servant is no longer relevant. And its second effect mentions Skull Servant itself, so Moisa White can also search it. And its second effect is, you can target a Skull Servant or King of Skull Servant in your graveyard, send 1 Skull Servant that mentions it from your deck to the graveyard, and if you do, special summon the target. So, let's say they manage to use a card effect to take out your King of the Skull Servants. You then send, let's say, White Lord to the graveyard, or White Mare to the graveyard, to special summon it again. You don't get the second effect because White Mare has to be discarded to get that effect, but you still special summon the King of the Skull Servants. Now, next up we have the supporting core, which will be the Eldritch core. This is just meant to be a good defensive archetype, something to help you out. Of course, we have Eldritch the Golden Lord, and its effect is discard or send this card in a spell or trap from the hand to graveyard, target one card on the field, send it to the graveyard. So that's just removal. This isn't really the important effect, however. If this card is in your graveyard, send one spell or trap card you control to the graveyard and add it to hand, and then special summon a zombie from hand. And then it gains attack if you do. Now, this is most commonly used to summon out Eldritch, the Golden Lord himself, which will be useful later. Of course, we have one of the Eldritch continuous traps, mostly used as a fodder to get Eldritch, the Golden Lord, out. However, we also have Elixir of Scarlet Sanguine, which, when you activate it, it special summons a zombie from deck, and if you don't control an Eldritch, it has to be Eldritch the Golden Lord. Oh, and just so you know, this one's Huaquero of the Golden Land. It just summons itself as a level 5 zombie with 1800 and 1500 attack. And then if you control Eldritch already when you activate it, you can banish a card from either graveyard. So, banish that. But also, if it's in the graveyard, you can banish it to set an Elixir spell or trap directly from the deck. And again, you could use that to add Elixir of the Scarlet Sanguine to special summon Eldritch the Golden Lord. Next up, we have Zombie World. Very simple effects. All monsters on the field and in graveyard become zombies, and neither player can tribute summon monsters except zombie monsters. So, since cards in my opponent's hands don't count as zombies, it actually locks my opponent from tribute summoning in that very specific case, which special summons are much more important, and the one normal summon is typically going to be used for a level 4 or lower, so this doesn't come up much. However, it could come up. Next up, we have Super Polymerization. Another fairly simple card. Its effect is simply discard a card, and then you fusion summon a monster using monsters from either player's field. So I can use my opponent's monsters to summon my fusions. Now, normally the discard one card would be a actual problem for a lot of decks. However, if I have White Prince and Super Polymerization in hand, I can then discard White Prince to activate Super Polymerization, and then I get White Prince's effect, and my deck wants cards in the graveyard anyways, so that's not really a cost in this one. Now, next up, we have the extra deck. So, to start off with, we have Eldritch, the Mad Golden Lord. It requires an Eldritch and a level 5 or higher zombie monster. Its name becomes Eldritch, the Golden Lord, on the field. It can't be destroyed by battle or card effects, so it's pretty good survivability, and with a stat line of 3,800 attack, it's pretty good. And once per turn, I contribute a zombie monster to target one face-up monster my opponent controls, but it can't attack or activate its effects, which is, again, it's just more removal because my other zombies can attack him. They're now less full board. And once again, since it requires an Eldritch or a level 5 or higher zombie, Zombie World makes all monsters on field zombies, and Super Polymerization makes it so that if my opponent has a level 5 or higher monster, I can then use their level 5 or higher as a sacrifice for Eldritch, the Mad Golden Lord. And that's actually the premise behind all of my fusions. They're more so tactical cards that I can use Super Poly to essentially take cards off of my opponent's board to put cards onto mine. Next up, we have Dragon Necro Nether Soul Dragon. This one's an interesting one. Has to be fusion summoned, and it cannot destroy monsters by battle. Instead, after it has attacked, at the end of the damage step, the monster's attack becomes 0, and you special summon a Dark Soul token with the attack of that monster that Nether Soul Dragon attacked. So, it's another flood option. It creates a token on my board that can then have a large amount of attack if my opponent's monster had a high attack point monster, and its effect activates even if it's destroyed. So if they have a monster with more than 3,000 attack, I can still activate this effect by attacking them. Next up, we have the Duke of Demise. This was actually released in the last set, Maze of the Masters, and its requirements are simply 2 fiends and or zombie monsters. So once again, super polymerization with zombie worlds can get this out really easily. Now, it does require an upkeep of 500 life points every turn during your standby phase, but it cannot be destroyed by battle, and also gives you 2 relatively good effects. You can only use each one once, however you can use both in one turn. Now its first effect is, again, just a generic double summon. Allows you to normal summon 1 monster in addition to your normal summon, so that's pretty good. But also, if this card is in your graveyard, let's say you didn't want to pay the 500 life points, you can banish it from your graveyard to add a level 4 or higher fiend or zombie monster from graveyard to hand. So, for instance, you choose not to pay the life points, it gets destroyed, and then you banish it to add a King of the Skull Servants in your graveyard to your hand. Now, finally for this deck, we have the side deck. Now, side decks are up to 15 cards and allow you to run cards legally in tournaments outside of your deck that, or like in between round 1 and 2 and round 2 and 3, you can actually switch these cards into your deck. Now, again, we just have more generic Eldritch or Golden Land in case you need to lower the Skull Servant amount a little bit just to get a more aggressive Eldritch play. So again, special summons itself as a monster, and then if you have an Eldritch the Golden Lord, you can just destroy a card on the field. And then during the end phase, banish the card from the graveyard to set a spell trap for Eldritch. Next up, we have Guardian of the Golden Land. Special summons itself as a monster, and then if you control Eldritch, you can make the attack of one face-up monster on the field. So either player's field, and you can make their attack 0. And once again, banish from graveyard to set a spell trap. So, with the inclusion of Moissanite, this deck has become a little bit more combo-oriented. Not really, though. It's more... These two are more an answer type card to the problem of King of the Skull Servants having the weakness of your opponent sets monster. All damage is negated. So, of course, the combos remain the same. Normal summon White Princess turn 1 to send White Prince to the graveyard. White Prince then sends Skull Servant and Lady in White to the graveyard. And then if your opponent makes a decent board right before they destroy White Princess, send her to the graveyard to reduce all of your opponent's monsters' attack. Running the defensive options of White Baking, adding, say, White Prince and White Lord, and including the Eldritch as a defensive option, and the Duke of Demise, pretty much for the same reason. It's a fairly simple deck. I don't know if it'll ever be good again. Like, it was actually terrifying to see someone pitching their entire deck to the graveyard. With the new Searcher, it becomes a bit more consistent, and if your opponent doesn't immediately destroy White Master, then honestly they deserve the loss. But that will be about it for the Skull Servant Eldritch build, otherwise known as the Deadbeats, built in honor of my personal Oshi, Mori Calliope of Hololive EN Gen 1 holomyth. And I'll see you in the next one.